Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Body Literacy Basics. We're going to get started. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put the questions in the chat and we'll come back to them at the end and have a discussion about anything that you want to talk about. Okay, and so with that, we'll just get started. So first off, the reason why I am hosting this webinar is because I'm celebrating 1 year of the Body Literacy Coloring Book and Visual Reader. These were two books that I released last August, and they are released with Creative Commons licensing, which means that you can use the images in the books. You can download them on my website and print them out, and you can remix them, change the design of them, play with them. So it's a participatory project that was meant to bring more visuality to the menstrual cycle and to fertility awareness, and just trying to get us to understand the menstrual body in a way that we really only talk about with the pregnant body. So I really tried to dive into that with these two books. So that is why I am celebrating this week. And in June of this year, I released the Body Literacy audiobook, which is a guided exploration of the two illustrative books. So there's descriptive audio for each page, and there's also insight and analysis behind each of the pages. So you can go into the books with a little bit more of an education about what I was thinking when I created each image. All right, before we get started, this is just a lovely disclaimer that says that this isn't supposed to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. So always seek the advice of your primary care physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions that you have regarding a medical condition. And with that, we'll get started. So body literacy basics is this presentation is broken down into a few parts. First, we're going to talk about the history, and then we're going to talk about the values of what body literacy is rooted in, and then we'll move on to the core principles of body literacy. And then at the end, I'll talk about the state of the movement and where we're at as a collective. Hello to everyone just joining. We're just getting started explaining what body literacy is before we get into some more of the specifics. So body literacy, what is it? It's a health concept that uses the menstrual cycle as a self-knowledge tool and a vital sign. And we also have a way of measuring our hormones autonomously. So without, blood tests or having to visit a doctor, we can get an idea of what's going on with our hormonal pattern. So body literacy means to learn to read and understand the language of the body. It's a practice that mainly involves observation. So we take our observations, we move them to an organized chart, and then we interpret the charts of our menstrual cycles based on these principles and rules if you want to use it for something like contraception. But it has a lot of health implications as well. So body literacy really helps someone understand the changes that their body goes through throughout the entire menstrual life cycle. That is from your first menses, which is called menarche, all the way to menopause and beyond. So body literacy really helps someone understand menstruation, reproductive health, contraception, breast health, post-abortion care, mental health. There's a variety of health tracking that can be done with this. So it's a very adaptable system that can really work for each individual and what they've got going on or what they're trying to figure out about their body at that time. So body literacy is part of the broader movement towards health literacy. You may have heard of health literacy before, which is the knowledge and competencies of persons to meet the complex demands of health in modern society. So no small feat, of course. Body literacy's reproductive politics are not solely about choice, though. They're much more about justice at the root. So body literacy is just a tool, and we can use it for a lot of different things. But the goal is to enhance reproductive freedom, informed choice, and the real frameworks that we're trying to work from here are reproductive and birth justice. So body literacy really uses information from the menstrual cycle as a component to how that person makes health decisions, because it's more participatory. They're very informed about their health. They have data that they've taken about their health. So they can start to understand what's abnormal for them before they even visit the doctor. And it really helps people further contextualize what's going on with their health, in addition to maybe some other clinical methods that they're seeking. This slide is just to say that body literacy is a skill with practical knowledge that deepens self-empowerment. But these patterns and changes are useful not just in the moment, but useful in that whole continuum of experiencing a menstrual cycle. And it's not just from an individual perspective. So even though we are talking about how the individual tracks their cycle and starts to understand what's going on with their hormonal pattern, the idea is that the society and the larger, more macro scale is that we actually have some menstrual justice take place in the whole society, so everyone be affected by this newfound understanding of what people with menstrual cycles need, what our unique needs are. So it's both a return to individual power that has somewhat been taken from us with certain engagements with the medical industrial complex, and it's also about communal power. So how we come together and actually change the things that into a future that we really want. And that is really a beautiful process through body literacy that I think is yet to be fully explored. Okay, now on to some body literacy history, just to give you an idea of where this term came from. In the early 2000s, the organization Tathapi, which is an Indian women's health resource organization, began developing the concept of body literacy, calling it a medium to scientifically explain the processes of the body, its parts and functions to men and women and children of different age groups. So they were probably the first to actually use the term, but in North America, independently, the term was used by Laura Werschler at the Society for Menstrual Research conference in 2005, and then it was further developed by menstrual health activists in this magazine called Femme Fertile, and that's the clip that you see on the right there, where Laura Werschler, Geraldine Mattis, and Megan Lalonde wrote the original thesis of what body literacy meant to them. And Laura Werschler is now an author at the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research, and she had continued to keep writing essays and other works about body literacy in the early 2000s. And then there was more of an adoption of the term by many different health and menstrual health activists of the term body literacy, and that eventually sort of expanded into Chris Bobel's work with critical menstruation studies. She's the associate professor of women's studies and the editor of the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies, which was the first of its kind. And she also mentioned body literacy in one of her books, New Blood, Third Wave Feminism and the Politics of Menstruation, in 2010. So you can see that the term was developing over the past 20 years or so. And now there are, both in India and in the US at Georgetown University, there are health initiatives that use the term body literacy. So now we'll move on to the values behind body literacy. Body literacy seeks to create a world where human right to menstruate is freely respected. So as I was just explaining, it's on an individual level, of course, but it's also on the societal level that we're trying to shift the needle. And people deserve to receive culturally sensitive, compassionate, inclusive, trauma-informed, and accessible education and care about their menstrual bodies, from the very time that they're first starting to menstruate and understand what menstruation is. Um, and the cycling body is, in my mind, could be respected for its unique needs, and where those needs could even be seen as a force of power in the society. So they could even be seen not just as a neutral and not negative, but as a positive, for seeing the strengths that it presents as well. So the foundation of values that body literacy proposes are reproductive justice, birth justice, and human rights in order to defeat reproductive oppression, which is what we are all dealing with globally. Oops. With this, we also need to be grounded in the history of gynecology, right? We need to understand that gynecology is a racist system, that medical apartheid has been the foundation of the medical system, and that these systems can and must be properly dismantled and defunded. So we have to prioritize serving the needs of oppressed peoples who have been harmed or excluded by the medical industrial complex and the larger forces of domination. This is just to say that healthcare is an extremely underserved area, and body literacy is trying to ground us in both the history of the medical industrial complex and also create a future where we are much more empowered and able to understand our bodies and fight for them, because we know them better than anyone else. So body literacy also, it's a developing thing. As I just explained, it's only about 20 years old, the term itself. So we must always be open to new knowledge. There's scientific information that we have been given that is frankly inadequate, or it's too biased. And so we're relying on really faulty information all the time when it comes to reproductive health. And that's a very frustrating position to be in. So when there's new knowledge, we have to make room for it. Things even that we aren't necessarily comfortable with. And then there's a balance between traditional knowledge, which is obviously very important because it represents other ways of knowing outside of, this history of the white gynecology. And then we have to allow space for change and multiplicity and dissent. So again, the idea is that it's a moving system, that we're all participating in it, and that we need to all guide it in various ways, in a way that reflects the justice principles behind it. Okay, so hopefully you're all with me so far. Thank you for being here. This is Body Literacy Basics. I appreciate you. Now we're going to move on to talking about the menstrual life cycle. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but this is the series of hormonal changes that shift during different stages in your life in the context of your ovarian hormones. So it explains how hormones go through phases and basically change through the lifespan. And so the menstrual cycle begins with menarche, or the first menstruation that one has, and adrenarche, which is the awakening of the adrenal glands, which happens right before you menstruate, actually. And that produces the sex hormones and helps further develop the body. So we'll go through quickly the main stages of the menstrual life cycle to contextualize this. And I really think that by demystifying the menstrual life cycle, we really unlock the context of our hormones in each life stage. And that's really the key to all of this, because it is constantly changing. Okay, so menarche, as I said, before menarche, there's a lot we can do for menarche. There's the fact that we could better explain anatomy. We could explain the changes before first menstruation. We could explain about the hormones like estrogen causing the physical development that occurs before menses. And that can all occur somewhere in between childhood and around the time the 1 to 3 years before you begin ovulating or menstruating. And then you start menstruating, and that's when you start making progesterone. So at that point, you can explain how this process is unfolding in the body. Cervical fluid could be explained. Learning to chart for one's health could all be explained from the very beginning with a body literacy framework. And so it's a new vision of menarche. And the hormones could also be contextualized as being important. So not only explaining what we're usually told, which is that there's a reproductive role to ovulation, but instead how the hormones help you as a young person build strong muscles and bones and a healthy brain, and it regulates many parts of your health. So these are all potential ways to engage with menarche. And as you can see from the graph, what's happening during puberty is that estrogen and progesterone are low in childhood, but then estrogen starts to become high and fluctuate. And that's where the first physical development happens. And then progesterone is low until regular menstrual cycles are established. So that happens, somewhere between 1 to 3 years later. And so that's how you can see the menstrual pattern developing during the menstrual years here. So talk about the menstrual years for a moment. The menstrual cycle in a body literacy framework would be contextualized as a vital sign. It would be taught as an investment into your later years. So the years when you make progesterone, when you're menstruating, are like an investment into your perimenopause and menopausal years because you stop making progesterone later in life. So it maintains your health for the longevity purposes. And so we could teach people about the 4 phases of their menstrual cycle, about their fertile window, of course, which gives them reproductive freedom, the connection between the brain and the ovaries, which explains a lot of various menstrual issues are related to that brain ovary connection. We could explain to people the ovarian and uterine cycle. Those 2 things really connect to a lot of various disorders that, again, by knowing this information from the start, that person would have a lot more context to go off of about how to make choices about their treatment. There's also intersections with the thyroid, with metabolic health, gut and liver health. And I think also during the menstrual years, these are also the reproductive years potentially for that person if they so choose. And so this understanding of the cycle can reduce issues with prenatal care. So I just think that by having a body literacy framework, we actually make pregnancy safer because that person is already, has a much better understanding of what's going on in their menstrual body. They're not just figuring out about their cervix when they're giving birth, and when someone's saying, oh, we're going to do this check for them. Oh, got someone here. Sorry about that. Someone there was unmuted. So yeah, I think the issues with prenatal care are huge. And the last point here is maximizing reproductive autonomy. So again, it lets you really choose like what you want to do with it. So do you want to use it as contraception? Do you want to use it to try to conceive easier on your schedule? Do you want to monitor your health issues and better understand your hormones? So those are the menstrual years. That's happening in the center there. Got some sort of strange issue here. Okay, so we'll move on to perimenopause. This is the transitional time that represents a critical window for your health. So it's hormonally related to puberty, where estrogen is high and fluctuating, while progesterone is slowing down and starting to descend. So, very early perimenopause is when cycles are still typical. You have shorter luteal phases, but generally the cycle is still ongoing. Then you move into the early transition stage where estrogen starts to fluctuate more. Your cycles become more irregular, symptoms show up. And then in the late transition, you start to have longer cycles, 2 months or longer. And then late perimenopause is when you basically stop menstruating and you count for 1 year. And once you reach 1 year, that's when you reach menopause. So it's important during perimenopause to maintain ovulation for as long as possible. And caring for the perimenopausal years, what the hell? Wow, this is so strange. I'm getting hacked in my own.
I think it was KH that started presenting. You might want to exit them out. Like the
Okay.
people with like no names.
Yeah, that was so weird. Oh my gosh. They shouldn't even be able to present. That's what's strange. Okay. Everybody all right? Sorry about that. Are you able to see my screen?
It's in a little window.
Okay.
Maybe you have to pin it or something.
Let's see. I will. We're dealing with so much spam lately. It's just wild. Like, I cannot keep up. Okay, I think it's all right now. I think they've exited. You're okay, Em. Okay, I think we're good now. Sorry about that. All right, if everyone can see this screen again. Basically, the idea here is that caring for perimenopause helps reduce the symptoms of menopause, and it creates a much more peaceful transition into menopause. So you can see here that the estrogen levels are high and fluctuating, that's the orange, and the progesterone levels are, that's the blue, starting to descend in the perimenopausal phase of life. And you can see that on the other end, puberty is like the flipped opposite. So it's like the activation of the ovarian cycle. And then on the other end, you actually have sort of the petering out of the ovarian cycle there, ending in menopause. So menopause begins 1 year after the final menstruation. And it's actually this change where your body starts making estrogen out of your cells instead of from the ovaries. So you don't actually stop needing estrogen. It's really good for your brain and your cardiovascular system. So you actually continue making it in smaller amounts, but you make it inside of your cells locally through this process called intrachronology. So it's this rewiring of the brain at this time, and it's a graduation in a way to more freedom. Humans seem to have evolved to have a post-reproductive state, like have a lot of longevity in the post-reproductive state. We really only, can reproduce for the first half or so of our lives. And that is probably due to our matrilineal social groups, to pass down culture and knowledge, and menopause in many cultures is seen as a rite of passage. Unfortunately, in the West, it's more like considered a deficiency, and about aging, but it's actually can be seen as a much more kinder, more peaceful, and childlike, even hormonally, childlike state. So you'll actually talk to a lot of people, and you know you'll hear these types of things in between all of the sort of more negative vibes. But there's a lot of time to focus on your own endeavors. If you have children, they're probably adults by then, and so yeah, it's an interesting time of life that I think could be seen in a much different light with the understanding of body literacy. And I think I had a question here. Does endocrinology happen after a full hysterectomy? Yes, if the ovaries are removed, then the body will start to go through the process, but it's more abrupt than, as you can see, like the perimenopausal period is like a long, it can be several years long of the stopping of menses. So when it's done through a full hysterectomy, like the ovaries are taken out, that's more abrupt, and usually there's some sort of hormonal treatment to help deal with the fact that it's going to be so abrupt for the body. But yeah, that's the idea, is that your body will start to make it intracellularly. um, yeah, I thought menopause makes you go crazy. Exactly. This is a very common sort of understanding of menopause, that it's something to do with hot flashes, and you start like feeling all, you know, dysregulated all the time. And if we look at this graph here, you can kind of see that that's actually more about perimenopause. It's more about that fluctuating estrogen and unpredictability that's going on in the years leading up to it. But then once you actually reach menopause, a year after your last menstruation, the hormones really should be way more stable than they are during the perimenopausal years. And the way that you care for yourself during perimenopause also will affect the menopausal years. So, for instance, if you care for the body during perimenopause, then during menopause, you may not continue experiencing symptoms that people commonly experience, such as night sweats and things like that. So yeah, keep that in mind. So that's the first sort of body literacy concept, is of the menstrual life cycle. And now we're going to talk about the interconnected reproductive system. The menstrual cycle also has to be really reframed at the site of the body. So the cycle has been conventionally relegated to the medical specialty of gynecology. That's like an effect of patriarchal medicine. You know, it doesn't see our bodies as whole, but like a combination of different parts, and specifically like just the reproductive parts. Yes, you do still get your period during perimenopause, but it gradually gets more erratic and also longer in between menses until eventually it stops. So in about late perimenopause, which could be anywhere from 3 to like 5 years in, you're going to start seeing like your menses be 2 months or more apart, and then eventually that will come to be like the last menses, and you'll count for a year, and then once you reach a year, then that's official menopause. Um, and so when menstrual cycles are happening regularly, they're more than just about reproduction, right? So they can't be just talked about in the reproductive capacity that they tend to be in gynecology. So making estrogen and progesterone in the right amounts is really important for our whole body regulatory needs. And on top of this, fertility itself is not just the reproductive system, it's a part of being in your adult body. And the menstrual cycle represents the infradian rhythm, or a rhythm that lasts more than one day, like a circadian rhythm. And so this core rhythm, your infradian rhythm, involves an orchestra of different body systems, like the endocrine system, the adrenals, the thyroid, and the menstrual cycle hormones themselves are intended to be balanced between the follicular estrogen and luteal progesterone, which provides bone balance and cardiovascular health and brain health. So the menstrual cycle is meant to be balanced in sort of two halves, with ovulation in the center, and this makes up your infradian rhythm. So I actually have a clip of that. So you can see in this graphic The infradian rhythm is the wheel, the large wheel that represents the menstrual cycle, with the follicular and luteal phases, the two halves, with ovulation as the dividing line. And you can also see that the fertile window is the days leading up to ovulation, and then ovulation itself, and shortly after ovulation as the egg becomes non-viable. So that's your fertile window for each infradian rhythm. So you can see that the menstrual cycle hormones are changing throughout that rhythm, but you're having daily rhythms of your circadian rhythm. So each day you have a circadian rhythm, but it's occurring on a longer rhythm of the infradian rhythm. So maybe who you wake up as in your follicular phase isn't the same as who you wake up as in your luteal phase. That could be based on the hormones. Um, it could be more pronounced for some people and less pronounced for others. But the idea is to understand that these subtle shifts are actually happening, and we aren't just existing solely on the circadian rhythm. So the menstrual cycle is a vital sign. In 2015, the ACOG actually made an official statement agreeing with us, menstrual activists, that it is indeed a vital sign, not just an indicator of fertility, but also that it concerns your general health. Okay, so what does it mean to have body literacy? The first thing to know here is that body literacy is about what's normal and healthy for you as an individual. It's a unique bioprofile. There's always going to be a set of what changing normal parameters of what's deemed normal based on medical statistics. There's various types of ways how we come up with what is normal. However, sometimes what is normal is derived from things like bias or medical misogyny. So we have to question what is considered normal as well as interrogate what is normal for us specifically, because we all have slightly different bodies and needs. And so when you achieve body literacy is when you understand the menstrual life cycle, like we said, the different phases of the cycle, how those hormones are shifting, and what your body needs at that time. And it's an acknowledgement that you're living on an infradian rhythm during your menstrual years. So those hormonal rhythms are the driver behind seeing your three fertility signs, and that's what we observe in fertility awareness, and as well as other secondary signs and other bodily signals like sleep quality or tracking your digestion and things like that. Body literacy means that you notice signs that are outside of normal parameters for you. You're able to be proactive about those things and address them before they become a full-blown disease and need to be treated more seriously. I also wanted to take a minute to talk about the limitations of contraceptive control, because the conventional narrative is that there's no need to have self-knowledge of the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. It's just unnecessary unless you want to become pregnant. Maybe then it would be necessary. But for the most part, if you talk to your average MD or gynecologist, they're going to say they don't really know what you're talking about. And conventional contraceptives are tools for fertility control. However, they do rely on invasive changes to the body, and of course, a lot of them alter the hormonal pattern. So contraceptives, when they're started early in life especially, they don't allow for the chance for that person to learn what body literacy is or to develop a relationship with their cycle as a vital sign. So although contraceptives are obviously necessary tools, body literacy is also a reliable methodology to understand your fertility, hormonal patterns, and general health over time. So one other aspect of this is that a body literate person is more likely to recognize side effects from contraceptive use or any medicine use, or any other changes that they find alarming from a medical device or whatnot. So it's interesting because there's this idea that this pushback, I guess, that the menstrual cycle isn't really necessary for you to get to know in any way. But what I find with a lot of my clients, especially ones that were quote unquote put on birth control from a young age, is that they feel like they do want to learn body literacy. So a lot of them are coming to me being like, I feel separated from myself in some way. So it's just interesting to note that. And then respect for the autonomy of the decision maker. Birth control is often seen as a solution, but it's actually rather incomplete without body literacy. So not everyone is going to want to use birth control for every single month of their menstrual life. Some people discontinue for various reasons. These are just a few of them. And what's cool about body literacy is that it really centers the autonomy of the decision maker. It centers them over the thoughts, feelings, biases of the practitioner. So that's really important to note as well. And even sometimes those biases are expert biases. So, like someone who studies something all day, even like myself, we become biased in the sense that we feel like we know a lot of information about the subject, but each person is different. And so, again, body literacy really allows that person to have a lot of data about themselves over time where they can use it to help make their own health decisions. So these are the 10 core tenets of body literacy. Number one is that body literacy requires the use of the senses. So we use observational skills, all of them really, but mainly seeing and touching and feeling, and a foundational understanding of anatomy in order to accurately identify our bodies and understand when they're functioning normally. The second is that fertility is an effect of whole body health. So, in other words, a healthy body tends to be a fertile body. And, I say that with the knowledge that some people's bodies will still be healthy for them without being fertile. That's completely okay, because fertility doesn't equal morally good and healthy doesn't equal morally good. However, what we're trying to get at here is that fertility is associated with markers of health. And so, with the sensitivity of knowing that that doesn't apply to every person, we can understand that what we've spoken about thus far is that the reproductive body is interconnected with the rest of the body system. So, fertility really goes beyond reproduction and actually has many functions, including making essential hormones during our adult years. The third is that society must learn to respect the infradian rhythm. This is important because it will change the way that we do things by understanding that week to week we are different and that we have different needs, especially in the luteal phase when we're leading up to the next menstruation. It's really important to adjust our routine for our energy levels and for our rest because menstrual work is work. We're going to be doing bodily work that basically goes unacknowledged. And that's part of the reason why it's so concealed in our society, why there's such a huge concealment imperative. Um, the next is that ovulation is the main hormonal event of the menstrual cycle, not menstruation. So, period positivity, there's like actually a lot of activism going on around periods, which is great. However, menstruation is sort of the oh, sure. Menstruation is sort of the result of ovulation. So it's important for us to really ground the changes that we see in the menstrual cycle as being associated with ovulation, because that's what's actually driving the whole hormonal process. So you can see here during the ovulatory phase, that's occurring right in the center of the menstrual cycle. There's all these different hormones that are having a lot of activity. So that is the main event of the cycle, and it's what causes you to make estrogen in preparation for ovulation, and it's what causes you to make progesterone after you ovulate. So you really need ovulation to make these hormones in the right amounts. The next principle is that cervical secretions are most reliable, diagnostic, or in the moment fertility sign. Um, this is about more than ambiguous vaginal discharge. We're talking about cervical secretions and how they can teach us about the hormone estrogen and also tell us when fertility is possible. So, by naming cervical secretions or cervical fluid or cervical mucus, we help people conceptualize what that fluid is where it comes from, and for what purpose it serves. So cervical mucus is produced by the cells that line the cervix, and it's the portal that connects the uterus to the vagina. And so you can see in this graphic here how the different types of cervical fluid either close off the cervix and stop sperm from entering, or facilitate sperm transport by opening and creating this fluid. The next is that the 3 fertility signs are important biomarkers that can be used to reliably understand the fertile window, and that we should teach this in sex education. Obviously, many of us have heard the notion that you can get pregnant on any day of your menstrual cycle, and this is, of course, not true. So it's important that we actually ground our sex education in, facts about the menstrual cycle. And the 3 fertility signs is a great way to do that, because we can reliably understand when the fertile window opens and closes, just based on observation. And so I'll go to the next slide because that shows that better, which is that the fertile window is a small part of the whole menstrual cycle. So, in other words, you can't get pregnant on every day of the cycle. It's only possible in the 5 or so days leading up to ovulation with cervical fluid, and ovulation itself, which is about 12 to 24 hours when the egg is viable. This is because of the role that cervical mucus plays in the follicular phase, and it basically is able to capture, select, nourish, hold, and transport sperm in facilitation of the potential of ovulation. And sperm are unable to survive in the acidic vaginal canal during the infertile phases when the cervix is closed and no cervical fluid is present. So you can see here in this chart that the red box represents the fertile window that I observed with the fertility awareness method. So using the rules of the method, I'm able to make determinations about when my fertile window opened and closed. But we don't actually know the exact, I don't have a camera inside of my ovary knowing exactly when the egg actually popped out, right? So following the rules of the method is how I'm able to do it successfully, but it's likely that the biological window of fertility is slightly smaller than the window that I observe. And the reason why the fertile window has buffers is to make sure to account for this process. So by following the rules of the method, you always have a window that is slightly larger than the biological window, and that's why 100% of the time it works for contraception if you're following the rules. One person asking here, so you can't get a period if you have sex on your period. I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm thinking you mean if you can't get pregnant if you have sex on your period. And that can be true or not true depending on how long the person's cycles are. Sometimes people exit their menses and already have cervical fluid present because they have shorter cycles. So in the cycle that I'm showing you here, it's 31 days long. So during my menses, I am not fertile during that time because my fertility window hasn't opened yet. It sounded like you said you can only get your period during your ovulation phase. Yes, you can only get pregnant during the fertile window. The fertile window is a small part of the menstrual cycle, but it's the only time when pregnancy is possible. It's just that fertile window may open overlapped with the person's menses if they have shorter cycles. So my cycle being 31 days, I don't have any fertility until about day 10 when my cervical fluid shows up. But it's possible someone with a cycle of 24 days that when they're still on their menses, that they begin generating cervical fluid and they ovulate earlier on day 12 or something like that. So the possibility of pregnancy on someone's menses depends on their total cycle length and when they start developing cervical fluid. So that's something else that would have to be developed as the person learns the fertility awareness method. And that's accounted for in the method as well in the rules. The next one is that body literacy is based on a holistic approach to the body, not a narrow specialty approach. So we kind of touched on this before, that it's concerned with understanding the social forces involved in oppression in general, not just reproductive issues. And also to look at the whole body and not just treat the menstrual cycle and the uterus as this separate thing. The graphic is just showing that at some point a person asked me why they got so much hungrier before they were about to bleed. And so I explained that their metabolic rate changes depending on which hormones are present. And so this is just one example where the menstrual cycle is actually dictating the person's appetite. And so it's just an example of how things are all interconnected. The next is the menstrual cycle length, which is variable from one cycle to the next, is also showing that the fertile window and ovulation day itself are variable from one cycle to the next. So we don't make any predictions about future cycles with body literacy. We merely observe the cycle as it is ongoing. And if you're choosing to use fertility awareness, we apply rules and methods to be able to better understand your fertility or your health goals. So this is just three different charts of mine, and you can see that on each of the charts, they all have different data points. Every day I took my temperature, it was slightly different. Every day I watched my cervical fluid, the observation's slightly different, but there's a pattern there. You can see that I ovulate in each of them. But my fertile window continues to shift. So even though my cycles are still around 30 or so days, the length isn't exactly the same. Maybe it's 31 days, 30 days, 29 days. And then the fertile windows are also slightly different. So this just goes to show why you can't predict future cycles. You always have to observe the cycle in the moment as you're experiencing it. And that's because you exist in the world and the menstrual cycle is affected by your environment. So you can't make a prediction about what it will be like in the future. And it's particularly why some of these apps and temperature only methods like natural cycles and things are problematic, because they assume that the algorithm can provide insight into something that's affected by the environment. So they're less reliable than a fertility awareness based method is, particularly the symptothermal method. And the last tenet is that body literacy is inclusive, secular, evidence-based sex education. It promotes body autonomy, it promotes informed healthcare choice, and it's built on the foundations of birth justice and reproductive justice. And it includes many different groups of people. Okay, so now we'll move on to the state of the body literacy movement and what's going on today with body literacy. The first thing is that the medical system excludes the menstrual. So the medical system tends to believe the myth that female bodies are inferior, that they're hysterical or unpredictable. Other things pop up like that they're wild or monstrous. And then all of those ideas are reinforced through systemic healthcare, and they creep into every corner of research and knowledge practice and even individual practitioners and how they treat patients. So the medical field has been historically dominated by cis men and has systemically excluded wise women and other forms of healers, creating narrow and reductionist specialty disciplines within medicine. And those, as we've talked about, don't serve the menstrual body as a humanized person very well. So most of the scientific research even done on the body was done on men, and a lot of times they just did not use women because they felt like menstrual cycles created too many variables and were inconvenient. We're also dealing with co-optation from corporate interests. So the period positive and menstrual awareness movement was co-opted by some of the very same companies that created stigma, such as menstrual product manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies. So the product heavy focused approach has been critiqued by more radical health educators who believe that the foundation of informed consent, bodily autonomy, and accurate education have to be prioritized And that is dangerous to allow for companies like Kotex to be the ones who are suddenly providing this education about what's period positive. And this is a really interesting ad. You should look it up on YouTube sometime. It's called You by Kotex, Go with the Flow. And the whole ad is about making fun of menstrual advertising, including like how the women are always like running or like in white pants. And whatnot. So it's really interesting to see them make fun of themselves and expect us to buy it, basically. We're also dealing with a menstrually unaware society. So body literacy exposes the systemic knowledge gap in that society. It's also a feminist research methodology. So we're trying to create social change and promote value systems that reflect our ways of knowing. And that means that it's heavily participatory. Each of us is charting our own cycles. And it may require other forms of knowledge gathering that's different from the dominant forms. For instance, if you bring your menstrual chart to a gynecologist, they may not even know how to read it. And so by charting our cycles and gathering our data, we begin sharing with one another and helping each other with various bodily needs. And so menstruation affects every aspect of life, social justice, gender equality, and political participation. We are also dealing with menstrual surveillance, which goes back to the mid 19th century, its origins, where prominent men created instructions on how to detect traces of criminal abortion. And the state can not only track pregnancies with menstrual surveillance, it can moderate large scale fertility altogether. So, like forced birth and forced sterilization are two sides of the same state control over reproduction, just depending on what they want. And so, because of this, they can broadly criminalize people who have menstrual cycles and people who become pregnant based on the state's prerogative. And like, could at this point, with what's going on, it could literally be the state. I meant the state as in like the whole government apparatus, but state by state, laws are changing, and we never really know how they're going to be applied. And the state is clearly interested in menstrual data. Um, So to explain this, there's a case right now where a Nebraska teenager was sentenced to 90 days in jail just this month. She pleaded guilty earlier this spring to a felony charge of concealing and abandoning a dead body. And in exchange, the prosecutors dropped two other misdemeanor charges. Her mother helped her obtain abortion pills and is also awaiting sentencing after she took a plea deal earlier this month, admitting to providing the abortion after 20 weeks, false reporting, and tampering with, again, human skeletal remains. And what's remarkable about this case right now is that the whole investigation started. Let's see. The whole investigation starts from a police detective that was chasing a tip that the teen had miscarried and that her and her mom had buried the body. We don't know who provided such a tip. And then the detective actually pulled her medical records and found that she was 6 months pregnant, and then went to interview her and basically like coerced a confession about the stillbirth. And self-managed abortion is not even illegal in Nebraska. So instead, the mother and daughter, were charged with this charge of removing a dead body, which is a felony. And then after they were charged, the detective served a search warrant to Facebook, and he was able to access messages between them that suggested that they had planned the abortion and it wasn't an unexpected stillbirth, which is what they had claimed. And then they added the charges of performing or attempting an abortion on a pregnancy at more than 20 weeks and performing an abortion as a non-licensed doctor. So this is an example of menstrual surveillance where these Facebook messages become part of a court case that's then used to criminalize someone for a self-managed abortion that actually it is not illegal even in the state where they're trying to charge them for it. So they, went to great lengths to try to punish this teenager for this abortion. Moving on from menstrual surveillance, there's also femtech, which is another type of biodata harvesting that is also part of menstrual surveillance, because it could be subpoenaed by the legal apparatus at any time. So there's been a really concerted and well-funded effort in recent years to really expose consumers to wearable biotrackers. You've probably heard of Fitbits and other fitness trackers. But there's also now a huge movement of fertility tracking. And it wouldn't inherently be terrible if we had, body literacy foundation and if there was proper privacy. But the problem is that we don't fully understand our own bodies, and we're quick to just become reliant on a variety of possibly dubious technologies to do so. So they're making lots of different claims. These are just a few in the femtech industry that are all making different claims about what they can do for you. And this technology is supposed to mediate our lack of knowledge of our bodies. And so the technology could be an asset and a tool that we, could have available to us, but instead it's being presented in a very different way, where it's more like something you don't have to worry about. Just let the app do it for you. And that is super problematic. We also have religious extremism in the menstrual space and reproductive space right now in a real way. There are huge issues to contend with. Much of the original fertility awareness research was conducted by Catholics to develop the field of natural family planning. And these groups were able to keep most of this fertility information to themselves. But in the years since Taking Charge of Your Fertility was published, there's been a growing interest in the secularization of fertility awareness and the removal of the religious and moral context. And that's a big part of what I've been trying to do with learnbodyliteracy.com, is to make a much more broadly inclusive site regarding body literacy than a lot of the frameworks that you might come across online. There's also an issue right now where some Christian and other religious groups have come after the secular body literacy and fertility awareness educators, threatening us with copyright or trademark infringements, or even an issue with FAM educators that were contacted through a popular educator database and were reprimanded for advocating for condom usage instead of abstinence to their clients. So you've got a lot of these issues also dovetailing with trying to teach body literacy. There's also violence and harassment of those working in menstrual and birth work. I just quickly Googled Planned Parenthood arson, and I found like 4 different cities across the US that all had people who had been stalking the clinics and eventually had been able to enact various types of property damage. And of course, it can get worse than that by obviously affecting human beings that work for these places as well. But in the OBGYN office, it's not much better. There's actually a lot of violence and abuse going on there. These are, again, headlines pulled from the last 2 years that also talk about medical misogyny, various types of reproductive violations that are occurring in medical facilities during giving birth, while the person is incarcerated. A bunch of women were abused by their gynecologist for many years. And then we have the situation at Yale where a woman who worked for this fertility clinic was swapping out pain medication so that she could sell it, and was letting these women go through fertility treatments with no pain medication, with just saline. So there's a lot to contend with there. And I think with body literacy, hopefully it'll help people advocate for themselves in the sense of being able to better understand what is abuse in a medical context, because a lot of us think it's normal because we've been primed and prepped to think it is normal. So, similar to rape culture and trying to uncover for people what is sexual assault, because many of us don't know. Medical misogyny is its own sort of needs its own awareness campaign so that more people can get the care that they need and actually stay away from and fire the doctors that are abusive. We also have a situation of mis and disinformation spreading rapidly in the menstrual health movement. Because FAM is blown up in some senses, it's been thrust into the public sphere. And that's a good thing in some ways to hear people talking about their menstruation more openly. But the message gets overrun with various types of misinformation that aren't rooted in an evidence base. And it's also incentivized because the way that our social media systems work, controversy and an abundance of meaningless content tends to float to the top, depending on how egregious it is. And because we are seeing, we're talking about menstruation, something that's already ripe for this type of like controversy because it has so much taboo attached to it. You tend to get media that doesn't necessarily represent evidence. For instance, this is a site called 28 by Evie, which is a site where they want you to enter your menstrual health information and they'll tell you different things about your cycle in different phases. And if you go to the luteal phase, it says progesterone brings symptoms of PMS. Progesterone is actually really great for relieving symptoms of PMS. So it's just directly, incorrect. And their whole website is dedicated to menstrual tracking. And really, it's actually about extracting the biodata from their customers. And so, yeah, we have to be really cautious of these various actors and what they are saying and whether it represents the truth or not. And the flip side of misinformation and disinformation is censorship. So, of course, I've had trouble with censorship talking about cervical fluid specifically. So you can see here's just a few censorship issues I've run into in the past. Going against the community guidelines, constantly being told that it's porn or that it's related to sex, when actually I'm trying to teach that cervical fluid has nothing to do with arousal. Yes, it is difficult to get by, absolutely. Representation also has limits. This is something that is often used in place of actually changing the system. And so instead of interrogating like the hard truths about obstetrics and gynecology, the public is just being told that if we just bring more Black, Latina, Indigenous doctors in, that and surgeons, that they're going to fix the problems inherent in a racist system. And this takes the heat off of the organizations that have upheld and reinforced and deployed medical harm while indoctrinating non-white medical students into that system. So, of course, representation is a tool. It can be effective in terms of it can be humanizing. It can increase trust. There's obviously people will list off the benefits. But in body literacy, we understand that representation has limits when it comes to addressing the systemic problems in healthcare. And erasure from our own study. This is another topic that is also going on where you basically have our menstrual cycles we want them to be studied, but then when they go to study them, they actually don't study our bodies. And there's actually a good example of this. The device that you're looking at is called a Syngina. It's a synthetic vagina that was made in the 80s so that they could test tampon absorbency. And the woman on the left is Nancy King Ream, who was a scientist who was basically like in charge of the task force over the tampon absorbency standardization. So she was like in charge of coordinating with all the tampon companies and testing their various tampons for whether they all were consistent with their absorbency ranges. And she advocated for using menstrual blood at least to flow through this synthetic vagina machine, and instead they wanted to use saline. So that's how we ended up with the saline studies instead of menstrual blood studies, is because this woman was basically ignored, and the companies themselves were allowed to just study us with this synthetic vagina, and it was considered, analogous. So we just have to question, what is the validity of these studies that are done that don't even involve us, but are trying to make claims about us. Okay, and so we'll round out today by talking about how does body literacy help people and advance our goals of reproductive justice. Body literacy is an asset for people who are highly motivated to learn about their menstrual cycle and fertility cycle, and the reasons for this motivation are widespread. It could be due to inadequate health care. It could be due to them wanting to become pregnant. Other people are curious because they have no framework of education or not even a vocabulary to describe themselves. Um, and in order for these highly motivated people out in the world to learn about their cycles, those of us who have closed this knowledge gap to some degree and have mastered fertility control autonomously, it's our job to teach them. And that's why I'm doing this free webinar, which I will upload to YouTube after, so even more people can benefit. But every day, the community grows a little bit larger as new people enter the work, and each person has a commitment to expanding that research, sharing their knowledge, and the community, I guess it's not necessarily cohesive. It includes lots of different groups. But my main goal with learnbodyliteracy.com is to provide a resource hub that has information about, for instance, cervical fluid, that has information about the menstrual life cycle, and that has more resources available for people who are dealing with various types of menstrual issues. Menstrual cycles are also markers of time, so it's kind of cool to experience the world through the cycles. And body literacy, I think, is already changing the world because it really helps people navigate their health as they grow and change. And that personalized knowledge helps you make informed decisions over time, about your sexual and reproductive health. And it really acknowledges the interrelationships between the physical and the mental and the emotional and the spiritual that really create the whole you. So um, it's a whole, context of how the menstrual cycle connects with all the other body systems in concert to protect your health and longevity. And that transition to body literacy, I think, will also encourage you to examine the intergenerational connectedness to your own body. I think we can learn a lot from our heritage, our food customs, knowledge of medicinal plants and other holistic techniques. And on learnbodyliteracy.com, if you do need resources, there's a whole resources section for you, where you can draw upon this or other folks in the community for advice about how you're dealing with a particular issue. And also, just to end on moving from organ centered to more whole body centered care. So really understanding that each organ has multiple uses and is not just for reproduction. So we're kind of always told, oh, this thing is for just this one thing. The ovaries are just for reproduction. They aren't for anything else. And it's a shame because body literacy is right underneath all of that. So, I hope that you enjoyed this presentation on what body literacy is, the history, and some of the main principles as well. This is, again, the body literacy coloring book and visual reader, which you can check out on my site. And they're also available in hard copy form, but you can download the images for free as well if you want to learn from them. They're also on my site itself, which is learnbodyliteracy.com. And that concludes tonight's chat. Does anyone have any questions about this presentation? I would be happy to answer. I'll go back over to the chat here. I think I have one question. Are periods syncing with other people a myth? Officially, yes, they are. It's considered a myth, but in the menstrual world, does it occur? Yes. So it's not a myth if it's real. I've had it happen many times in my life. So I like to say that it's more that we don't understand the mechanism that sometimes causes it. However, I am not ready to call it a myth because it's happened to me, and then secondly, um, I think that there's just a lot of, like, similar to what I was saying earlier. There's a lot of unknowns with reproductive health because it's been so underserved and understudied, and so for me, it's more of a question of what we don't yet know about the cycles. But it's way too common of a phenomena for people to just be like, oh, well, it just isn't true because science says it's not. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand with it. If it's happening to you, I would say it's really interesting for us to do more study on it. Maybe in the future we could all like move in with our best friends and see if it has any effect, and then write that down with our cycles, and we could see the effects, and um, we could just design the study and figure it out. Um, thank you all. I appreciate it. I'm glad that you liked it. I just wanted to give a well-rounded introduction to this subject because we are trying to formulate and shape what it is. And if more people know what it is, then they'll use it and they will help create more of the research around it. So thanks for being here and being a part of that process. Um, I really hope that you enjoyed it. And if anyone is up for a epilogue here, I do have one other thing that I would like to show you if you want to stick around. It's a very recent article from, let's see if I can find it on here, from the MIT Technology Review. Whoop, get off here. So yeah, that concludes the official presentation. But if you would like to stick around and look through this article with me, feel free. This I just thought was so fascinating because it came out just last week, and it says tiny faux organs could crack the mystery of menstruation. Researchers are using organoids to unlock one of the human body's most mysterious and miraculous processes. My understanding is that they are making these organelles by growing them in the lab, organoids. Um, let's see here. So, oop, do I have someone else trying to enter? Yes. Hello. Welcome. We are just chatting about this review that I just read last week called Tiny Faux Organs That Could Crack the Mystery of Menstruation. So there's this reproductive biologist that they start the story off with, and they're like, oh, they're organoids. A small group of scientists are using tools akin to miniature organs to study a poorly understood and frequently problematic part of the human physiology, menstruation. So already really starting off with like very negative language, obviously heavy, sometimes debilitating periods. Yes, we know 100%. They also, when they talk about heavy periods, they tend to say that they are like a detriment because they make us less productive. So here's that point. Oh, they miss school and that's why it's bad. Um, and then they talk about some other, you know, real, real shit, such as, needing surgery and whatnot. Obviously, menstrual cycles are extremely painful and problematic for a huge portion of the population. So it says no one is entirely sure how or why the human body choreographs this monthly dance. Many people need treatments to make their periods more manageable, but it's difficult for scientists to design medications without understanding how menstruation really works. So this I always find really funny too, because it's kind of like you don't understand how menstruation really works? Like, I'm sorry, but like, how? Like, we do know how it works. Like, it's not like completely mysterious. So that's the first thing. And that's kind of what piqued my interest about this article. So they're like, but wait, we will be able to understand it because we are taking tissue that lines the uterus, so the endometrium, and they're making endometrial organoids where they collect cells from a volunteer and then they let those cells, what they call self-organize in a laboratory dish, where they develop into miniature versions of the tissue that they came from. The research is still in its infancy, but organoids have already provided insights into how endometrial cells communicate and coordinate, and why menstruation is routine for some people and fraught for others. Some researchers are hopeful that these early results mark the dawn of a new era. Okay, so then they're like, let's talk about the issues. They're like, the reason why we haven't studied menstruation, their claim, is because it's so rare in the animal kingdom that we just don't have any animal models that we can work with to learn more about it, which is interesting because humans are there, of course. But on top of it, that's not the reason why we don't study menstruation. We actually don't study it because of a social stigma that is super strong and that, has creeped into all parts of medicine and science. Science is an extremely sexist and racist rooted profession. And so it's interesting that the article sort of pivots to saying that the reason why they didn't adequately study the menstrual cycle is because animals don't provide a laboratory model that they can use. And they need models to be able to do the types of tests that they do. Okay, so they're saying the cycle is a constant pattern of wounding and repair because you're getting rid of your endometrium and making new ones. So, okay, we get all this. No other human tissue is known to grow so extensively and so quickly, not even aggressive cancer cells. As the tissue heals, in a rare example of scarless repair, it becomes an environment that can shield an embryo, which is a foreign entity in the body, from an immune system trained to reject interlopers. Scientists have filled in the rough outline after decades of research, but many details remain opaque. How the endometrium repairs itself is unknown. Why people have heavier periods than others remains open, and why humans menstruate rather than absorbing their endometrial tissue like other mammals is still under debate. And they're saying that this lack of understanding hampers scientists who want to find treatments for periods that are too painful to be, dealt with through the normal avenues. Okay, it says heavy periods again. It's going back to the original thesis that like menstruation is super difficult for a lot of people. It causes various issues. Ask researchers why menstruation remains so enigmatic, and you'll get a variety of answers. Most everyone agrees there's not enough funding to attract the number of researchers the field deserves, as is often the case for those health problems that affect women. The fact that menstruation is shrouded in taboos doesn't help, but some researchers say it's been hard to find the right tools to study the phenomenon. So again, they just give it one line. They're just like, yeah, oh yeah, there's taboo, but really it's because of the animals. So they're like, yeah, these other animals that we usually use for research, they don't menstruate. And so that creates limitations. Then it says in the 1940s that a zoologist was working on an animal model for menstruation and found what are they called? The elephant shrew. Yeah, the elephant shrew. And the elephant shrew menstruates, but they're not cooperative study subjects. So they like don't menstruate on the same schedule that we do, and they also like couldn't catch them, and they like weren't able to study them in the lab. So they kind of gave up on the elephant shrew. And then some bats also menstruate. So they tried to work with bats a little bit. And I think they ended up saying here there's like an issue with the bats. Trying to get them to work on the menstrual experiments with the bats wasn't working out either. And then they also found the spiny mouse in 2016 that it also menstruates. And spiny mice can be raised in the lab, so they became more valuable subjects for this menstrual research. But because we are not very closely related to them, their uteruses and our uteruses really differ to the point where they're like, I'm not sure that this animal model even will suffice to be something we can extrapolate about human beings. So it goes on to say that much of the foundational work on menstruation has been formed on macaques, which are primates, but they're very expensive to care for. And there's a lot of restrictions because they are, considered more complex beings than some of the more common lab animals. I personally don't agree. I think all the animals are very smart, but they also found that they could sort of humanize lab mice to have something similar of a menstruation. So that model has been somewhat useful. But again, it's scientists always trying to like extrapolate out instead of studying us or involving us in the study of our bodies. So again, like they're trying to get close, but not really working with the animal models. So it says there's logistical challenges and ethical concerns to studying women. One is that the endometrium evolves very quickly at what they're saying is an hourly rate. And so in order to do tests, they would need to perform invasive biopsies almost constantly to study inside the human body. And so for the whole equation, it says that a zoologist in the early 1900s was working with sea sponges, marine sponges, and he noticed that their cells have like a memory of how they're arranged in the animal, even when they're separated. And it was pretty interesting how like he did this experiment to separate the cells, and then when they were all put back together again, they like reformed into the original sponge. So they had this memory even though they were separated. And a 2009 study described a possible way of extending that observation into human organs. It took a stem cell from a mouse intestine and embedded it into a gelatinous substance, and then it sort of formed a miniature simplified version of intestinal lining. And so it was the first time that scientists had created what they're calling an organoid from human tissue. And then they did it with a bunch of other tissue types, lots of different ones, like from the gut, kidneys, and brain. And then they did it with uterus. And so it says that they had been trying to study endometrium by growing its cells in laboratory dishes. But the stromal cells, which provide structural support for the tissue, provided an easy way to grow on that lab medium. But it also made them adhere to petri dishes. But the epithelial cells, which are the other critical component of the uterine lining, stopped responding to the hormones, and their shapes were not like what's seen in the human body. So they ran into issues when they first started playing with the human menstrual cells. And then our reproductive biologist, instead, she added, I think it says both the endometrial and stromal cells here, suspended instead of being, and given just the right mix of molecules, and they grew. And so they basically created these placental and endometrial organoids, and they used them in the lab. So it's pretty interesting how they're saying that they are using tissue from biopsies rather than stem cells to make organoids from the endometrium. And they're even using tissue removed from some people who've had hysterectomies, or bits of endometrium found in menstrual blood also works. So this is kind of scary in a way, because it means someone could potentially grow an endometrial organoid without like biopsy or surgery. They can just basically use the blood as it exits your body and produce these organoids. Potentially really cool too. I mean, I suppose there's some sort of medical implementation that would, you know, be a possible benefit, but you can see how it's also very dystopian at the same time. And so from all these starting points, researchers can now create microcosms of the human uterus, is what they claim. I didn't get this part. Each organoid reminds Tozlova of a tiny bubble suspended in a gelatinous dessert. Don't quite understand. But okay, so moving on. A period in a dish. So they're like, yeah, we're growing these organoids now. They've been doing, you know, different experiments since 2017. It says, you know, there's a few different techniques. They're trying to create tissues that are, you know, more workable in the lab, that they can use for experiments. And this is interesting too. It says a video from one of the recent publications shows an assembloid remodeling around a 5-day-old embryo. Before he and his colleagues did this work, conventional wisdom said the endometrium was passive tissue that was invaded by the embryo. But that's completely wrong. This new understanding of how embryos implant could improve in vitro fertilization and explain why some people are prone to miscarriages. Okay, so and this is an image. You can see the organoids directly made from the endometrium on the left, and then from the menstrual blood on the right, of the same person, have indistinguishable shapes and structures. Menstrual flow is a non-invasive source of endometrial organoids, they said. Okay, so you with me so far? This part, now, this is where it really got interesting for me. It says, eventually, Critchley hopes scientists can design treatments that let people choose when to have a period, or if they even want to have one at all. So again, really interesting that they're just like, oh, we don't know enough about the menstrual cycle. We want to know so much more about it. We're researching. And then really the whole point is to just get rid of it. Like, it's weird how at the beginning they're like, we really care about everyone with menstrual pain. But like, this literally provides the exact same treatment as the existing treatment, which is to take away the cycle. So yeah, interesting turn of events in this piece. And so, yeah, it says, you know, hormonal birth control can accomplish this for some people, but it also has lots of intolerable side effects and unpredictability, you know, issues. And so here again, they say scientists still need to understand how a normal period works. Making an organoid menstruate in a dish would be a huge boon for achieving this goal. So that's what some researchers are trying to do. I would love to take a poll of those of you who are in the chat. Do you agree that this organoid use in laboratory studies, do you think it will help people achieve the goal of helping people with their menstrual issues? Um, it says by manually adding hormones to organoids, they can replicate some of what the endometrium experiences over the course of the month. And as the cycle progresses, they get to see the cells adjusting to the complement of genes that they use, or just as they would in the human body. And the shape of the organoid follows a familiar pattern. Glands change from smooth tubes to sawtooth-like structures in this faux menstrual cycle. This part here also really just like very very explanatory. where they're like, it's mind blowing that we're very close to the patient, but we're not working within the patient. So again, it's just like this question of how useful is taking us out of our own study, erasing us from our own study. So it says with this system working, the next step is to figure out what happens when the endometrium malfunctions. So this is when they start messing with the organoids and seeing how they respond to different treatments, what causes endometriosis to develop into the condition that it is and whatnot. It also says endometrial tissue growing into the muscle that lines the uterus seems to cause lesions, which can be one source of excessive bleeding. That's typically called adenomyosis, not endometriosis. And they're watching these endometrial organoids, and they're trying to study endometriosis through that. Let's see. Now, it says today's endometrial organoids can't do everything the animal models can do. They don't include components of menstruation, like blood vessels and immune cells. They can't reveal how distant parts of the body, like the brain, influence what's going on in the uterus. Again, like those medical silos that we were talking about in the presentation are related to this. So I also wanted to show you this part at the end. It says, in parallel to the work on organoids, which again are developed from living tissue, scientists have created an organ on a chip that mimics the endometrium. These are tiny tubes affixed to a flat surface that carry liquids to the endometrial tissue, mimicking the flow of blood or hormones transmitted from other parts of the body. An ideal model system could combine endometrial cells in their natural arrangement as in an organoid with flowing liquids on a chip. And if you look this up, it literally looks like a microchip with like some tubes on the end, where they're like going to be feeding the various substances into the endometrial tissue. So it says, organoids have helped researchers solve old puzzles. And it says other researchers have tried to fix various problems with the menstrual cycle through this. So it says people who menstruate have waited a long time for researchers to tackle such questions. Burdensome periods are often seen as just a woman's problem, a mindset Tozlova disagrees with because it ignores the fact that people struggling with menstruation often can't contribute to their full range of talents to their communities. It's a societal problem. It affects every person every way. So I just thought this was a really interesting article because it has a lot of interesting elements related to contemporary reproductive politics, and also a few issues, ethical issues to contend with as well. So I thought you guys would enjoy that, reading through. So let's see. I'll go back to the chat for a second. Are they doing this research because they're also trying to figure out how to grow babies outside the womb? Yes. I mean, personally, I think that it's got to be related, right? I mean, it seems it's too obvious to not see the connection between they're obviously trying to regrow these organs, grow them for maybe people who don't have them, who have lost them, grow them for new people who want them. I'm not sure, not totally sure what the end